During the July 28th episode of the NPR news program Morning Edition, former Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg stated that most reasonable people would recognize that there are serious fairness issues if you just treat this as not mattering when a trans athlete wants to compete in women's sports. He then went on to say that parents of cisgender girls in girls' sports who believed trans girls competing was unfair, quote, have a case, and that he believes these decisions should be in the hands of sports leagues and school boards, not politicians in Washington trying to use this as a political pawn. All I could think when I heard that was that it sounds really similar to current California Governor Gavin Newsom's newfound determination to keep trans women out of women's sports. He's only doing it out of fairness to his wife and daughters. At least that's what he says. It reminded me of a quote from my grandmother, and that quote was, "A lie don't care who tell it." So welcome once again to She Really Gets It, a public health podcast. I'm Stephanie Rhodes, a Black woman, public health professional, and your guide to understanding how policies, institutions, and the systems that uphold them harm the public's health, but also how people are coming together to repair that harm and change the system. In this episode of She Really Gets It, we'll break down Pete and Gavin's lie and why false narratives like this are a threat to the public's health. So I don't know exactly when this episode will air, but at this point in time, Pete Buttigieg represents a long line of supposedly liberal politicians who believe they can improve their political standing by truly using the most marginalized as a scapegoat, by crushing the lives of the most oppressed 1% of their base in service of the top 1%, the wealthy, the billionaires. So in the name of public health, we're going to operate on objective facts because all of our lives truly depend on it. So Pete specifically mentions trans athletes in women's sports. He never mentions men's. And that's because, let's be clear, it's only women's bodies that need to be controlled. It's only women's bodies that need to be a specific size. It's only women's bodies that shouldn't be too strong or too masculine, as some would say. And today I'm going to explain to you how the ban on trans women in sports will not only be used to deny all women access to the right to play sports, but it will also be used to restrict us from access to health care, unless we're, of course, giving birth to all those babies. You see, the argument used to keep trans women out of sports is the same argument that has already been used to keep Black cisgendered women out of sports. Because you see, in a white supremacist patriarchal framework, any woman that is not in alignment with Eurocentric beauty standards will have their womanhood questioned. And these women will always be as good as trans. So an attack on trans women is an attack on them, is an attack on us. The example I will use to prove this point is the Olympics. And we'll start with a man named Pierre de Coubertin, known as the father of the modern Olympics. He founded the International Olympic Committee, known as the IOC, in 1894, and the first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens, Greece in 1896. Now, no doubt, Pierre was a racist, white supremacist who believed that aristocratic white males were the only true Olympic heroes. In fact, the IOC has continued to be led by all white men, many of whom were well-documented racists. In fact, it was Avery Brundage, who was the IOC president from 1952 to 1972, who was so anti-Black, he was known as Slavery Avery. And while you may not know his name, you have likely seen the image of Olympians John Carlos and Tommy Smith thrusting black gloved fists into the air while standing on the Olympic podium at the 1968 Games in Mexico City. And it was Avery Brundage, known as Slavery Avery, that was responsible for evicting them from the Olympic Village. And he would later go on to say, well, he would refer to them as boys, stating that people of that kind should not have been there in the first place. Now, I want you to continue to follow me because the nonsense I think I've seen on social media has made it very apparent that most people out there don't realize that racists and white supremacists and Nazis are inherently sexist. They're always inherently homophobic, and they're always inherently transphobic. You cannot separate them from that, because white supremacy inherently demands hierarchy. It demands polarity. It's why they repeat the lie that you are either biologically male or biologically female. And in their minds, intersex people shouldn't exist, right? So that's the polarity, right? So it's why they say things like the strongest woman could never be as great an athlete as even the most mediocre of men. And if you are a woman who is better than the men, right, your sexuality, your gender needs to be questioned, because you are a threat to the polarity, but you're also a threat to the hierarchy, right? This hierarchy that says that men are better than women. But because that's not real, you have to have strict rules in place to enforce it, because it's not real. It's not natural to have this extreme polarity. You're one thing or another. You're black or you're white. That's not real. That's a system that is in place. And the moment you start chipping at that and start questioning that, you threaten the entire system. You are the greatest threat there is. So that's why Slavery Avery, who was very racist, so racist that he had that nickname in 1968. Okay. And Slavery Avery believed that women should be restricted from events that weren't truly feminine, like putting a shot, or, quote, those too strenuous for most of the opposite sex, such as distance runs. So what happens when you live at the intersection, okay, of anti-Black racism and sexism, and you can run faster than the men, right? And you are perhaps maybe stronger than some men. You're definitely more skilled at your sport, right? Well, in the minds of the IOC membership, you're as good as trans. And that brings us to the 2020 Summer Olympics that were held in 2021. So there were a select group of Black women, Black African women, that were cisgendered, that were banned from specific track and field events. And this was not because they were doping. They weren't altering their natural hormones. This was not that kind of situation. They didn't break any rules. But the following biologically female athletes were banned from specific track and field events due to being too competitive, due to threatening the narrative of hierarchy and polarity. Because if there's one thing that white supremacists are good at, it's telling stories. And these athletes were Caster Semenya from South Africa, Christine Mboma of Namibia, Beatrice Masalengi of Namibia, Margaret Wambui of Kenya, and Francine Niyonsaba of Burundi. So all of these women are biologically female and cisgendered women, meaning they were identified as female at birth and they identify as women and they are competing in women's sports. All of these women are of African descent and are visibly Black. And despite the fact that they are all cisgendered women and they were not doping and they were not in any way enhancing themselves to give themselves some type of advantage or externally taking anything to give themselves an advantage, the overwhelmingly white and European governing body that is World Athletics, that the International Olympic Committee relies on to manage specific rules and policies around track and field, well, that World Athletics, that governing body, that European governing body, banned them from events where they were deemed to be too competitive. How wild is that? So how did they make this determination? I want you to listen closely to how they made this determination, because it's actually an excellent lesson in racial profiling. So it started with Caster Semenya. So this starts, at one of her first major events when she was around 18 years old. So in 2009, Caster Semenya won the 800-meter sprint at the World Track and Field Championship in Berlin. And she did this at 18 years of age. And due to her win and her physical appearance, nothing else, right? Her testosterone levels were checked by World Athletics. No other athletes had their testosterone levels checked, only hers. And it's based solely on the fact that she won and her physical appearance, right? So the results of that test were never released to the public. It just so happened that after the testing, even though the tests were never released to the public, World Athletics created guidelines banning women who naturally produced 10 nanomoles of testosterone per liter or more from competing. And get this, not all women are tested. Only those who have an appearance that is deemed suspicious by a bunch of Europeans. And what do you know? They seem to only find Black bodies suspicious. They seem to only find Black women's bodies suspicious. They have a suspicious physical appearance. So, of course, we have Caster Semenya being tested at 18 years old because she won and because she is deemed suspicious looking as a Black African woman by a bunch of white Europeans. So if you were a petite blonde and you got second place or third place, and let's say you actually do produce more than 10 nanomoles of testosterone per liter, but your appearance isn't suspicious to this white European governing body, you're not going to be tested. You're not going to be banned because your physical appearance is not going to be deemed suspicious by this European governing body. And this rule that was established, no more than 10 nanomoles of testosterone per liter, right, was used to selectively test specific women. And it turns out only these African women are tested. Right? So this rule was then used to selectively test these African women, the ones that I listed earlier, and then ban them from events where they won medals, right? So to further illustrate, once again, how ridiculous and racist and sexist this guideline is, because please remember, there is no maximum testosterone for men in sports, period. As long as they're not taking any drugs to enhance themselves, whatever they naturally produce is fine. There is no test. There is no maximum. The sky is the limit. The world is their oyster. This is only for women, right? And only women that are deemed to be suspicious looking. To further illustrate how ridiculous this was, we're going to look at Christine Mboma as well. So Christine Mboma, she won the silver medal in 2021 in the 200 meter after being banned from the 400 meter due to her naturally occurring testosterone levels. So this really upset retired Polish runner Marcin Urbis. So according to him, she, quote, has the parameters of an 18-year-old boy. And at that age, my personal best was 22.01, and she's done it in 21.97 in Tokyo. He then stated, quote, I would like to request a test on Christine Mboma to find out if she is a woman, end quote. Now, according to Urbis, he's most concerned for the other women athletes, not his own ego, because Christine Mboma, looking how she looks while being a woman and beating his personal best, is, quote, an insolent injustice against women who are definitely women. And, you know, he's the sole determiner of who is definitely a woman. He gets to set those parameters. And if you fall outside of it, well, good luck, honey. You don't get to play sports. You don't get to be competitive. You shouldn't be on that podium because you don't look like a woman to this specific teeny tiny man from Poland. But of course he frames it as, I'm just trying to protect the women. He needs women up on that stage that certainly can't beat him. That's a threat to his concept of what masculinity is. Because in his mind, in the mind of men that think like him, women have to be the extreme opposite. So smaller, delicate, softer, not as fast, not as strong, and of course, not skin so dark, right? That's what femininity is then for him. So no one should ever question his manhood. That would be insane, right? Because based on these same rules, I should be able to say like, oof, sir, I beat your time. Are you really even a man? But that would be insane. That would be the ultimate insult, right? Can you imagine any woman calling and demanding that a man's body be tested because he scored too low? He can't be a real man. That would be crazy. And if you're wondering how the then IOC, International Olympic Committee member, and World Athletics president Sebastian Coe responded to Marcin Urbis's request to test Mboma, well, he was cool with that. And he even suggested expanding the testosterone cap that had been placed on the 400-meter event, expanding it to the 200-meter event to prevent her from competing. That's right, the caps for naturally occurring testosterone in biological cisgendered women only applies to events where these Black African women, I mentioned earlier, compete and have won medals. So World Athletics is chasing Black African women around from event to event, testing their testosterone levels and creating testosterone caps based on what they find. Let me put it more clearly. White European governing bodies are chasing Black African women around to prevent them from running too fast. And the justification for this is that they are protecting women's sports. So how does that work? You're protecting women's sports by preventing the most talented women from competing in women's sports. It sounds to me like you're protecting the narrative that says that real women can't compete with men, that real women look a certain way, come in a certain size, and that real women aren't Black, not too Black at least. It's like those fairy tales we used to watch when we were kids. You know, there's a reason why the world erupts whenever there's a single Black Disney princess every 20 years. It's because that stories are powerful, right? So that's why so the majority of the princesses for any of these companies have to be a white Disney princess. You got to have a white Disney princess, right? And that's programming. You're drilling that into children's heads, like what a princess looks like, what a woman looks like, what a girl looks like, what femininity is. And so once again, stories are powerful. We start living those stories that are told to us about ourselves every day. And they get in our head and they make us limit ourselves. We start asking permission from those with power as to what we are allowed to be, what we're allowed to look like, how expansive we're allowed to be. Unfortunately, a lot of people in power, people that are in positions of authority and education, believe in these stories. One of these people is Swiss-American Duke University law school professor and former elite athlete, Dorian Lamblet-Coleman. You see, Dorian has dedicated years of her life to advocate for the restriction of both trans women and Black cisgendered women like Mboma and Semenya, who do not fit the Eurocentric standards of womanhood, from participating in sports. Because Lamblet-Coleman has her own story that she loves to tell, and it's her story of being a poor girl who was the first female recipient of a full track scholarship to Villanova University. She goes on to say in an article titled "A Victory for Female Athletes Everywhere," quote, "I was recruited because I was one of the best under 18 female half-milers coming out of U.S. high schools that year, because even mediocre boys could and did run faster, had Title IX, not forced colleges to create programs and set aside funds for girls. I wouldn't have gotten that scholarship, and because my family was poor, I might never have gone to college." Guys, like, her life would have been like so over if she had had to compete with one of those super masculine women from Africa. Let me tell you something, Dorian. You would have figured it out. Maybe, just maybe, you would have grown into someone that imagined a far more expansive world in which one doesn't need to be an athlete in order to be deemed worthy of an education. Maybe you would have fought for a world in which you don't feel the need to push others who are far more marginalized than you off of the life raft. A world in which you don't equate being a woman in leadership with stripping other women of their identity. A world in which you don't feel the need to deny other women the right to compete in a sport in which they excel. Instead of critiquing a system that prevents kids from getting an education based on income level, you instead do the work of patriarchal, racist systems, and you work to prevent other women, and specifically Black women, from even competing. Pathetic. I know that right now that there are Black women listening to this podcast who do not believe that what is happening to Caster Semenya is transphobia, that do not want to believe that the mistreatment and masculinization of one of the greatest athletes, if not the greatest athlete of all time, Serena Williams, was transphobia, that it's simply misogynoir. I would argue that it's both. I would argue that the ultimate goal is for women to be banned from competitive sport, period, as part of a larger plan to control all women. But you gotta start somewhere, and the fight is multi-pronged. At the same time that over 300,000 Black women have been forced out of work, legislators in Texas are passing legislation that allows them to track the movement of pregnant people, and Black cisgendered women are continuing to die in childbirth at alarming rates. And certain comedians are getting on large platforms to declare that Black trans women are the real enemy. Black trans women aren't writing the legislation that is literally restricting our movement. An attack on trans women is an attack on all women. They are simply the Trojan horse. As of July 25th of this year, trans women have been banned from the 2028 Olympic Games, and track and field's race and sex-based restrictions designed to restrict the cis Black women like Caster Semenya and like Christina Mboma from competing have become a blueprint for other competitive sports like swimming. Even soccer is considering implementing testosterone rules in the sport as well. Now, what does that have to do with public health? Everything. As a public health professional, I believe, or rather I know, that healthcare is a human right. Restricting one's access to their human rights starts with dehumanizing them. And then you erase them. I can't even tell you exactly how many intersex children are born in the United States every year, or how many currently exist, because it is not considered to be a reportable condition. That's policy. And why do you think that's policy? It's policy because it reinforces polarity, the binary, and erases everything and everyone else. Everything they are doing to trans women, they plan on doing to you. Currently, the Trump administration is requesting the medical records of all trans youth in the United States. They will ask for yours next. If they can deny that trans woman hormone replacement therapy, they can and will do it to your menopausal mother or your perimenopausal sister. Soon they will be back to sterilizing Black and Indigenous cis women without their consent, if they haven't already. I would argue that they never really stopped. But once you give them permission to deny anyone's humanity, to deny anyone their basic human rights, you have given them permission to do it to you too. Like I said at the beginning, a lie don't care who tell it. Don't give anyone permission to lie to you and to dehumanize those that have less power than you. That's right, you're gonna have to hold some of your faves accountable. Because when Gavin Newsom and Pete Buttigieg say that trans women have no right to play sports, they are opening the door to deny any woman that lives outside of that Eurocentric gender binary the right to play sports, the right to use the bathroom, the right to go to the doctor. And the moment they open that door, it's our job to slam it shut. If you are interested in supporting trans youth and their families, I invite you to check out the work of the Trans Youth Equality Foundation. The Trans Youth Equality Foundation provides education, advocacy, and support for transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming children and youth and their families. You can learn more about their work by going to their website, www.transyouthequality.org. If you enjoyed this episode of She Really Gets It, please review and rate this podcast via Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you have any topics you believe we should explore on future episodes, you can join my Substack and reply to any of the emails I send out.